Hello, in this video I'm going to be presenting an argument in which I try to show that the Pillars of Heracles are probably the Strait of Gibraltar. Now, the location of the Pillars of Heracles is one of the most important parts of the Plato's dialogue in Atlantis because that really establishes the boundaries and establishes the possible locations of where Atlantis is. Because if the Pillars of Heracles are not the Strait of Gibraltar, but some other strait that's closer to the Greek world, for example, the Straits of Messina, then it allows us to kind of understand the possibility of the Atlanteans actually just being a Mediterranean civilization coming in from the Western Mediterranean Sea. But if the Pillars of Heracles is established as the Strait of Gibraltar, then really Atlantis must be a civilization that is coming from outside the pillars, outside the Straits of Gibraltar, and a civilization that we are generally unfamiliar with, a lost and unknown civilization. So that illustrates the importance of where where the Pillars of Heracles are, because it really um, defines the degree to which Atlantis is either a novel civilization or possibly a familiar one. And so the question of where the Pillars of Heracles are is really related to the question of how much did the ancient Greeks understand about the world in the time of Solon when the story was first brought to the Greek world. For example, this is around the time of maybe around 600 BC. And some people have suggested that the Greek knowledge of the world in the time of Solon at around 600 BC was much more limited than it would eventually become in the time of the classical and the Hellenistic period. Clearly, obviously, by the time of the Hellenistic period, the Greeks' awareness of their world had greatly expanded to encompass the entire Mediterranean world, let alone to encompass the entire world of the Near East and the Middle East, and up to including Persia and India, let alone the Mediterranean world, which they were very much familiar. And even in the time of the classical world, it is generally conceded that the Greeks' knowledge of the world, especially of the Mediterranean, was very much encompassing the entire Mediterranean as we know it. And there are passages that I will show later in this video which clearly establish that the Greeks were familiar with the Mediterranean world all the way up to the Strait of Gibraltar, and that they consider the Pillars of Heracles or the Pillars of Hercules to be the Strait of Gibraltar. But the question is whether in the Archaic period, in the time of which Solon lived, whether the Greeks must have been familiar with the Pillars of Heracles and identified that as the Strait of Gibraltar at that time. And our view of Greek history may not be an accurate representation in all respects. In other words, our knowledge of Greek history in terms of its actual events as taught in the classics may not be really in correspondence with what we think they knew of the world at the time. And the very much fact, this is a kind of a very established claim, and that is that the Greeks were a very worldly civilization from a very early period. And the Greeks had actually colonized much of the Mediterranean at a very early time in its history. Even in the archaic period, which is generally considered to be before the 6th century BC, the Greeks had established colonies far and wide across both the Mediterranean world and the Black Sea. And we know that the Greeks by the early classical period had come to identify the Pillars of Heracles with the Straits of Gibraltar. And I will be showing you a quote that establishes this. And this is a passage showing that the mental geography, in quotes, of the Greeks in the time of Pindar, who was a famous Greek poet who lived mostly in the 5th century BC, but partly in the 6th. This is an important quote by a scholar which firmly establishes that the Pillars of Heracles were almost certainly the Straits of Gibraltar. For wise men are fools to travel beyond the Pillars of Heracles, with the example being given that an Olympic victor by the name of Theron, who having reached the pillars, turns back. But it is already known by this time, in the time of Pindar, that the colonies that the Greeks had established had already been far beyond the Pillars of Heracles. That is, the Greeks had long established colonies in all parts of the Mediterranean with well established trade connections with the mainland. And so, if the Pillars of Heracles as seen by Pindar wasn't the Straits of Gibraltar, but some passageway or other landmark closer to mainland Greece, why would they be described as a place that is impossible for wise men or fools to go beyond, when the Greeks had already ventured beyond them, and it was clearly possible for the Greeks to venture beyond? And Pindar, as a very educated and representative person of his culture who would have been aware of those events, would certainly not have described them as being impossible for wise men or fools to go beyond. So by the time of Pindar, it is clear that the Pillars of Heracles have been identified with the Strait of Gibraltar because that is the landmark and that is the barrier beyond which the Greeks would be, or anyone would be, a fool to venture beyond, and not any other passageway, for example, than the Pillars. And this is a map that really illustrates the degree to which the Greeks have ventured beyond their immediate um, central location, which is right here. They had shores of the Black Sea all around, and they had also colonized Italy, which was given the name Magna Graecia, and they had also established colonies far beyond in the Western Mediterranean. And these colonies actually date back to the time of around Solon. And the idea is that Solon, as who was a merchant by profession, who he would have been familiar with this entire world. And the idea that these colonies were just completely isolated from awareness of a merchant who was considered one of the wisest men of Greece, not just of that time, but of all time, is just really unbelievable. The Greeks had established these colonies in Iberia at the time in which Solon. Hello. And the principal argument here is that the Greeks weren't discovering new lands. They weren't discovering new areas of the world that they were unfamiliar with. To the contrary, people establish colonies in areas that they are actually familiar with as a general rule, because creating colonies involves an enormous investment in time and resources. It is not something that people just do haphazardly or just on a whim. And so the story of Columbus and the colonization of the Americas at its very earliest periods is this dramatic exception to this general rule. Columbus actually tried to venture into a world that he was largely unfamiliar with, and that has been this exemplar of colonization that we have come to accept and to understand in terms understand as colonization in the general sense. But that is very much the exception to the rule. As a rule, people establish colonies, countries establish colonies in areas that they are largely familiar with and aware of for a very long period of time. And that familiarity and that awareness is actually what motivates that colonization. And so that really kind of drives the familiar with the Iberian location. They were familiar with the Iberian region for a very long time before Solon had actually lived. And so this kind of illustrates the point that the mental geography or the Greeks' understanding of the world didn't change very much from the time of Solon to the time of Pindar, which is when the the Pillars of Heracles had come to be identified with the Straits of Gibraltar. So even during the time of Solon, the argument goes is that the Pillars of Heracles were likely identified as the Straits of Gibraltar at that time too. As Solon was speaking of them in the Egyptian in the Plato's dialogues, were almost certainly the the Straits of Gibraltar. And any argument that suggests that the Pillars of Heracles were anything other than the Straits of Gibraltar is likely flawed and has to be rejected.